I'm Sarah Seastream. I'm a Hannes Coos tribal member, artist, and educator. I live in Portland, and I'm represented at Ogden Gallery.
Hi, I'm Tarika Powell with Sightline Institute, a Seattle-based sustainability policy research center. My research focuses on fossil fuel infrastructure. My research supports what we call the Thin Green Line, which is the Pacific Northwest's resistance to the building out of fossil fuel infrastructure in our region.
My name is Marianne Nicholson. I'm Tsao-Danach from the Musqueam Tsao-Danach, from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nations, and I'm an artist and activist, and I've been part of this ongoing project between the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria and Indigenous artists in Portland. For a number of years we've been developing this around the issue of water.
So, welcome. This is the We Are Water, a community conversation. And to begin this program, I want to extend our appreciation and gratitude to be gathered here on the traditional territory of the Chinook and Grand Ronde and to be guests on this territory. And we have, fortuitously, this amazing backdrop of work by Umatilla artist James Lavador. So, such great timing that this work is up for us to be having this conversation here. So, my name is Nicole Stanbridge. I'm the Curator of Engagement at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria up in BC. I'm of British and Norwegian descent. My colleagues, Michelle Jakes and Marianne Nicholson, we live and work and are guests on the territory of the Lekwungen people in Victoria, BC. And we're on an island surrounded by water, so we talk about water a lot. I want to thank Blake Shell and Disjecta for hosting us and helping this have this happen here, and collaborating with the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, and for all of you to be here. Thank you for coming. So this conversation, We Are Water, is part of an ongoing project called Wawi Talala, the Pervasiveness of Water, or Cannot Go Against the Tide. So this is a project we've been working on with artist Marianne Nicholson. It's a collaborative, cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary project looking at issues related to water with an approach that privileges an Indigenous worldview. As a cultural institution, where Michelle and I work, this allows us to address the colonial structures that we function in, and it helps us to appreciate the interconnectedness of how water issues play a role in all aspects of our lives. And so amongst all of us here today, we'll be approaching this from many perspectives and many views. And so I hope we can all be as open as possible in that process. And I just wanted to share one of our colleagues in Victoria, France Trepagna, who's an Indigenous curator and artist. She shared with us her 5 Indigenous perspectives for how she does her work, and I think those are really important ones that we can kind of all think about when we're doing this kind of work. So it's respect, responsibility, relationality, relevance, and reciprocity. So I think those are all really key things in the work that we're doing. And I think in Western European ways of thinking about art, it has its own category, but in many cultures, what we think of as art are cultural practices, customs and rituals of daily life. And so as a way to frame the work we're doing in this conversation, to see the interconnectedness of things, helps us to think about the many types of practices, disciplines, and ways of being as we explore the questions, how do water issues impact our lives and the place that we live? So I just want to introduce first the kind of facilitators that will be in this program. So first we have Blake Shell, the director of Disjecta. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, welcome. Thank you for coming. I am the new executive director here at Disjecta since April, and I have been really excited about being here at Disjecta, both for the contemporary art programming and specifically for the potential for greater community conversations to happen here in this space. And I feel really fortunate that this is one of the first ones that we're able to put together here. So yes, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you. And Michelle Jakes will also be co-facilitating.
I work with Nicole up at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in Victoria on Vancouver Island. I've been there for almost 5 years as the chief curator, but I moved to Lekwungen territory from Toronto, or what we now call Toronto, which is on lands that are the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee people. More recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit. But that said, Toronto was a place that was a bit of a mecca for artists from all cultural backgrounds, including Indigenous artists. So it was interesting, the conversations that I'm used to participating in my experience working in Toronto at the Art Gallery of Ontario were often about, I guess what you would call the urban Indian, and how those concerns related to larger conversations about identity that interconnected with a lot of cultural communities. So it's been a pretty remarkable experience for me to move west, to the West Coast, where I have the immense honor of meeting artists and individuals who remain so connected to their traditional territories. And that's really created a shift in the conversation for me. So I have to admit that I'm here as a little bit of an interloper. Nicole is the person really taking a lead on the project from our institution, but I'm really, really keen on learning how this kind of conversation can maybe displace the more traditional or conventional kinds of exhibitions and programs that public art museum is used to doing. And so for me, this is a learning experience and a kind of opportunity to figure out how relationships between artists and issues and our communities can become the meat of what happens in a public institution.
Thank you. And so we're going to have the three invited guests introduce themselves, and then after that we'll open it up and stir on some of the ideas that come up in their introduction. So we're going to start with Hannes Kuss, artist, educator, and theorist, Sarah Seastrom.
Hi, you guys. It's really nice to see you. It's an honor to be sitting up here with these folks. I got to meet our First Nations guests in 2015 at the Museum of Contemporary Craft. We were doing a talk there, and we were very lucky to have them in the audience. So this is kind of following through with the conversation that we've been working on for a couple years now. It's also really exciting to be doing something at Disjecta in the new kind of direction that we're going to be working on here in Portland, and to be sitting in front of Lavador, of course, is a really exciting thing. So do you want me to go more into anything?
Sure, maybe just a little bit of an introduction about the project,
Okay.
the ongoing project you're doing now with the movie.
Okay. As she mentioned, I'm an artist and educator. I started as a painter, but I also work in institutional reform and education. So when Dr. Dark came on at the Portland Art Museum, she hired me as a consultant, and so through my work with them, I started to have really privileged access to collections and knowledge holders. So through that work, I started studying the traditional weaving of my culture in order to create a weaving program for my tribe. Our weaving tradition has been hibernating since the 1850s. And so our generation is doing a lot of cultural reclamation. And so as an artist and educator, it kind of followed suit that I would work in that vein. So yeah, and then that brings me into activistic work. And the way that my work can serve water protection is through my students. So my students work for the tribe. They work in natural resources. So when I teach them weaving practices, then they can take that back into the work that they do. So when I teach them the different plants that we use for weaving, which all grow in the water, then they take that back in, and we can use that information to help protect the resources politically.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And our next guest is from Seattle. So Tarika Powell is the Senior Research Associate with the Sightline Institute.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here this evening. I work for Sightline Institute. It's a sustainability policy research center in Seattle. In plainer language, it's a think tank. And we work on a number of issues of sustainability in Cascadia. That includes Washington, Oregon, and BC. So we do environmental sustainability, affordable housing, and research on improving our democracy. And my research focuses on fossil fuel infrastructure. I've been researching a lot of the proposals for large export terminals here in the Pacific Northwest, and we've seen an onslaught of that in the past 10 years, where the fossil fuel industry is basically trying to turn this region into the new Gulf Coast. We have a lot of oil and natural gas resources and coal resources in the Rocky Mountain region and in the interior of Canada, where the quickest shipping route to get those materials to Asian ports would be through ports in the Pacific Northwest. So the fossil fuels aren't located here. We would just kind of be the place where the refinery terminals would be located, and so we wouldn't be getting very many benefits from this, and we would be taking on the risks of pollution and water consumption. One of the other major concerns is that the reason there is a surplus of materials that they're trying to ship through this region is because of fracking. About 2/3 of the natural gas that is produced in the U.S. now comes from fracking. And so in terms of getting those terminals built, that would just increase those processes, really having detrimental impacts to people all along the supply chain. And one of the things that we've seen, and I think that we've seen historically, is that indigenous communities are some of the communities that are most strongly impacted, whether it's through the takings of land or where the pipelines are located, and all the way down to who's impacted if an incident happens. What we know here in this region is, for example, if you have an oil spill, indigenous communities are usually the first people that respond, especially when terminals or pipelines are located remotely, because they're the only ones out there. And so one of the things that we have been trying to do is to work with tribes and First Nations to bring out more information about what those impacts would be.
Okay, thank you. And then we also have from Victoria, Zawadzeno artist Marianne Nicholson.
Hi, it's an honor to be here tonight, and thank you for coming. My English name is Marianne Nicholson. My Kwakwala name is Aegilokwa, and I'm from the Musqueam Zawdena of the Kwakwakiwak. And the Kwakwakiwak people live kind of central coast of British Columbia. Those are our territories, but I make my home in Victoria right now. I'm an artist. That's kind of, I guess, how I make my living, but I'm also kind of a political activist. And the community that I come from, Kinkum, is in its original location from like our very beginning origin stories. And I partly grew up there, and I saw so many changes happening in the land that it wasn't that I kind of aimed to be political or activist. It was just something that, needed to kind of be there as a reaction to what was going on around us. So we've seen a lot of changes happening in our territories, and one of the things that we've been fighting recently is the fish farms. So within the Musqueam Zawdena territories within the Broughton Archipelago, we have the largest number of fish farms in all of BC. And so last year we were actively protesting the presence of these fish farms, and that the Canadian government wants to increase those farms, the number of those farms within our territories. And it's all without our consent, because we haven't agreed to any of it, and we're actually adamantly opposed to it. So right now we're actively strategizing as to how do we respond to this kind of fish farming incursion within our territories. And another thing that happened, say within the last 6 months, was that there was a diesel spill on one of these farms, and it was really interesting to us to see the reaction, because our nation sent out helicopters right away to monitor what was happening, but the response on the part of the government and the industry involved, CERMAC, was very dismal. So it gave us an indication as to kind of what the general situation is for the coast, and kind of what the threats are to the environment that exists. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. So we will open the conversation up now, and I mean, are there right off the bat, are there any questions from the audience or more information that you're wanting to hear from the panelists?
What's the focus? I mean, as far as how are you going to attack the issue? Is it going to be political or logistics, or?
Like, how are the issues related, like water,
Yeah,
to the topic that is water? Well, and the thing, we do realize this is a huge topic, and this is why we're having these programs. It's huge. It's so kind of overwhelmingly huge.
My question is, how are you going to narrow the focus so that we can keep it?
Well, we're not narrowing it at the moment. At this point, we want to keep it open so that we, I think the people we've invited today are looking at, at this point we're looking at the Pacific Northwest in particular, but the scope of the project will expand eventually. The way that, just to give a bit of context of why this program is happening, Wawi Tlala will be an exhibition in the future down the road at our art gallery. But the way that we're building it is we're doing a series of pre-programs. So the research and the development of the project, it will be done really transparently and with a lot of collaboration. So what this really is a way to just, in an informal way, with some, specific kind of aspects of research that these individuals are doing, for us to talk about it and how that might personally be impacting each other. So it may be from a political perspective, from a scientific perspective, as an artist, as a community, somebody who's advocating for their community. So it will be coming from a lot of different perspectives. So we're, at this point, it is really open, so that we're casting a wide net, so to speak, to see what we can bring in.
I wonder if I could ask a question that maybe ties together a few of the threads.
Yeah.
And we, all of us got together yesterday, and we were having dinner and a conversation, and there were many things that were said that stayed with me, but something that I've been thinking about, Tarika, you were talking about how when you put your information together, once you've researched an issue, sometimes you're putting the information together for communities that are in a bit of an emotional state because they've been hearing about a project that is going to create jobs for them. And you mentioned something, you said that you have to be creative and come up with a way to language your position that will be equally kind of emotional. So to me, you're talking about, you're all talking about information and knowledge, and maybe for Tarika, it mainly manifests as scientific report, and for Sarah and Marianne, it manifests as art. But somehow politics, knowledge, and creativity all ties together and is very necessary to all of the work that you're doing. I wonder if anybody wanted to talk about that a little bit. Maybe Tarika, because
Sure. Well, what we were talking about yesterday is that, as I was saying, some of the projects that have been proposed here would be the largest terminal of their size in the world. We've seen proposals in the Pacific Northwest for the largest coal terminal in the world. The largest methanol refinery in the world was proposed in Tacoma. it would have used 10 million gallons of water per day. It would have produced over 1 million gallons of wastewater per day. The message that they were giving people when they came to Tacoma is the same message that terminals give to people when they come to any city. Typically, their sort of selection process includes, well, what would be a good port, a good easy port that can accommodate our ships, but also what would be an area where we really get a lot of resistance. And so what you find is that these terminals are often proposed in cities where there are not a lot of job opportunities for people. And so they lead with the message of jobs. Even if this massive terminal is only going to have 12 jobs, well, everybody who's unemployed imagines that they might be one of those people who can get that job. So that's an emotional message. People need to be able to feed their family. And so then I look at the terminal and I say, oh my goodness, it's going to use 10 million gallons of water per day. It's going to produce over 1 million gallons of wastewater per day. It's going to produce, diesel particulate matter. And, then I do a piece of research that has, 100 citations for 5 pages. I have to make that interesting to someone who will want to read it, because I'm going up against a very tough message, which is jobs. And, for me to say, well, it's only 12 jobs. Well, that's still 12 jobs. So what I really have to do is to convey to people the message on the same lines of what these people are doing, which is what are the values of this community? What are the things that they care about? And in the Pacific Northwest, our region has for a very long time been a global model of sustainability, and that's something that we're proud of in this region. We don't want to be the new Gulf Coast. It's just not who we are. That's not where we want to go. We want to be a leader in sustainability. And so really what I try to do is lead with a message that focuses on what people's values are. And then once I have been able to reach them on the level of our shared values, then I give them the facts because, then they're ready to listen to what I'm saying. And one of the things that relates to the work that we do with tribes in this region is that, for example, we've done some research for the Quinault tribe at Grace Harbor, where they have seen proposals for three large oil terminals. I believe at this point only one is still standing. Fossil fuel projects don't have a good track record for actually getting through in the Pacific Northwest, but we still are seeing an onslaught. For example, just in BC, they have 20 proposals for fracked liquefied gas projects that would, about half of them would be each bigger than the biggest one that already exists in the world. If the projects went through, it would double BC's emissions. So these liquefied natural gas projects would produce the same amount of emissions as every other process in the state, in BC. So one of the things that we have done, like with the Quinault tribe, is to look at, well, what has been the history of oil in this region and how has it affected that tribe in the past? And I was telling these guys yesterday that one of the biggest oil spills in the history of Washington State happened right outside of Grays Harbor. And so we'll really look at what would be the impacts to that tribe if there was an oil spill of the type of oil that is being transported there. It would affect not just their fishing industry, which is their primary industry, but also cultural traditions, such as the plants that grow in the water that are used for weaving. Well, they wouldn't be able to harvest those for some years. And so that's how my work as kind of a nerdy policy wonk really comes into play with the real world applications of people's lives.
Have you spent much time looking at what's been happening down in the Coos Bay North Bend area with the Georgia Cove project?
Yes.
I think that is a microcosm of what's happening regionally and how different political factions are uniting against the fossil fuel industry because they understand that the real money down there is tourism and fishing, and this will destroy all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another thing. Well, you have to balance. One of the things that we bring up is that, say we did build this terminal that would give us 12 to 15 jobs. well, what would be the impacts of this terminal on the other jobs that already exist in the region, tourism and fishing, which are very important to people. And so part of what I do is pointing out like the balance that you have to weigh. But yes, I have been looking at the Jordan Cove proposal. My sort of specialty is liquefied natural gas, which is kind of a complex topic, right? Because first of all, people already have a really positive view of natural gas. It has the word natural in it right there. It says natural. It must be good. And so it's actually not, like I was saying, most of the natural gas that we have today in both the U.S. and in Canada comes from fracking. It's a very destructive process, very harmful to the communities that are around it. And what you find is that a lot of people, even though they think of natural gas as clean, when you talk to them about fracking and fracked gas, they know that that is not clean. And so you really have to overcome that messaging, because I think people's perceptions of natural gas is one of the really first successful forms of greenwashing, where you have something that is not very clean or safe or healthy, but people have this impression that it is. And you know, once upon a time, natural gas used to be better than it is now when fracking wasn't a part of the process. But one of the issues with fracking is that it uses a tremendous amount of fresh water that are needed by for other uses in the community, and then it produces a tremendous amount of wastewater that is so toxic, there's really nowhere you can dispose of it. So we have what we call injection wells, which is basically they dig a well out in the middle of nowhere and dump the wastewater in there, and those are what's connected to the earthquakes that people link to fracking. And not only that, but the wastewater we find is migrating into groundwater and aquifers.
They're destroying entire aquifers.
Right, so we're consuming a lot of water for this process, and then we're producing wastewater that's so toxic that we can't do anything with it. And so the water conversation, you have to look at both of those in, not just the water consumption, but what kind of water is coming out of it also.
Yes.
I'd be interested in hearing from Marianne what kind of art you make, and when you said you're an artist and an activist, do you, I'm assuming you don't keep them separate, or maybe an example of how you've used your art in an activist way?
Yeah, it was interesting, like kind of when I was partly growing up in Kinkham, the way that I was taught about our relationship to our land was very specific, in that my uncles made a point of telling me when we would travel through the territories, they would say, these are Musqueam, Zaudena territories, don't forget that, and these are the stories that link you to the very beginning of time. So that was my understanding of these places that we were traveling through. And it really wasn't until I went to university that I realized that our actual legal position with the Canadian state was that we were actually allocated these very tiny reserves. So in Kinkham, we live on like a 3 square mile reserve, and that's our largest reserve. And so I had such a hard time, coming to terms with these very different perceptions of our place in the land. And what I did was that I chose to believe what had been handed down to me, which was our traditional understanding of our relationship to the land. And so one of the things that I did in 1998 was to create a giant pictograph at the mouth of the river where our village is. And it's like a 120-foot cliff, and I painted a 38-foot high by 28-foot high, or 28-foot wide image of our origin story on that cliff. And that was because I wanted to acknowledge in a visual way our understanding of our place in the land, and recognize that, because what was happening was that the industries and the government were refusing to recognize that we had rights. And so they were coming in and logging out the land. They were, like the issues with the fish farms. These things were all in development at that time. And so I thought that as an artist, that was what I could do to kind of affirm our not only our jurisdiction, over those territories, but also that we, that we were present in those territories, because in many ways we were, in a way, almost legally erased. And then it's been an ongoing kind of, I guess, negotiation from there to ensure that our ways of understanding our relationship to land is manifest and in a public way, so that there is an alternative to kind of a Western capitalist, extractivist relationship to the land. And so I try and share that in my art practice.
I was just thinking about this idea in the research that Tarika does, and the knowledge that Sarah and Marianne have of the history and the culture of their communities, that knowledge is power. And so in all of the work that all three of you do, through research, whether it's research or art projects or community projects, you're coming up with solutions or alternatives. So Tarika's finding a way to present this information to highlight how damaging it can be. Marianne is, addressing and asserting her community's place on that land. And Sarah is finding a way back to a tradition, to a practice that was lost, right? So this is the thing I think that is so, that's why I want to kind of, that category of art, I want to kind of blur that, because I think it's about solutions and alternatives, because a lot of the time we can talk about the problems, we know what they are, we can sit here and go, this is the problem and it looks like this and this and this. But what I'm hoping we can do in this project is also kind of come up with some solutions, and within the realm of art we can imagine things that are way crazy, like could this even happen? But by imagining that, maybe it does, like maybe that does actually happen, and how amazing would that be if it could? So and I think in the research that you do too, I mean, it's like, how far can we go with this? How big could it be? So I don't know if anyone who wants to share kind of any of the work or experiences they have where they've been able to imagine something or come up with a solution or an alternative that kind of moves a thing forward or proposes a different way of doing.
I'm interested in access to water and providing high quality, plentiful water wherever we are, and doing that in a way that's responsive to the watersheds that we're in. And I have some ideas for how to do that, but I'm interested in hearing about what y'all think about how we do that as a community, preserve this access. And frankly, we're not preserving access because not everyone has access, right? So preserving it and expanding it.
I've talked a lot, so I'm just looking that way to try to give somebody else a chance to try to talk first. Or I could talk.
I love it when you talk.
Okay. Expanding and preserving access. When it comes to fossil fuels, the problem is that local communities have a limited set of tools. There are so many things that are, obviously in the way that our system works, you have the federal government, state government, and local government. And each level of government has control over a certain amount of things. Federal law preempts local law and state law. So, for example, if federal law says that companies can do a certain thing, but people in Portland don't want those companies to do that, well, federal law preempts that. You can't pass a law that goes against what the federal law is. So when it comes to a number of things related to fossil fuels, there's a limited amount of control that we have. So for example, oil trains and coal trains, those fall under federal law. So even though we don't want oil trains coming through our communities, we can't stop oil trains from coming through our communities. You also have certain restrictions in that way in terms of terminals being sited. But one power that local communities do have, and one way that at Sightline we've been trying to shift that conversation, is the local land use power. Local communities, local government can decide zoning laws, what type of industries or construction can go in certain areas and what type cannot. They can place size restrictions. So through that zoning power, one thing that they could do is limit fossil fuel infrastructure. And Portland just passed some really groundbreaking limits last December, which I think will be upheld on appeal. But that's one of the ways that we've been trying to think about it differently. Instead of going from, like I said, we've seen a tremendous amount of proposals in the last 10 years, and we've been going from proposal to proposal to proposal trying to stop it. And we have been very successful, but that can be very exhausting as well. So if you were to, for example, use the local zoning power to prohibit the terminals from being proposed there in the first place, then you don't have 5 different facilities that you're trying to fight in Portland, 5 different facilities that you're trying to fight in Victoria. And that those local, just finding those local ways in which the community does have power could be one of the ways to change what you were talking about access and expanding access. But that's the only thought I have on it right now.
Do you have that? I have that. Right?
Yeah, I'll have a thought after you have your thought.
Okay. Well, what connects to that is that, you know, when we talk about Indigenous land rights, and particularly in Canada, in BC, and I am interested to know how different it is kind of down in the States and in these territories. But within BC and certainly within my own territory, there were no proper procedures that the provincial and federal governments enacted in order to legally acquire the rights to the land, to much of the land in British Columbia. So one of the major issues, stumbling blocks for industry, has been the existence or the lack of extinguishment of Aboriginal title in BC. So that's why they've been pushing and pushing and pushing to try and figure out how do we gain this access, because right now a roadblock to much of this, particularly say a lot of the pipelines coming through, is that there is a recognition that Aboriginal title in BC still exists, and for the nations that don't want these pipelines coming through, and the ones who want to protect the river systems and the ocean, that has become a huge stumbling block for the industries. And I guess for us, we've been trying to assert kind of the consideration of Indigenous law, and how does that affect Canadian law, and we've been looking to assert our land jurisdiction. So when I was talking about the artwork that I did, it was to assert our position that we have legal rights under our own laws to these lands and the decisions that are being made in these lands, but that we also have not had those rights extinguished through Canadian law. And that is a huge stumbling block, and it's interesting because technically or strategically, the assertion of those rights can protect water systems to some extent. The industries will attempt to get around these things, but it certainly exists as a stumbling block for them.
But they seem to just ignore it in this country. I mean, like corporations simply ignore a lot of treaties. I mean, like the whole thing with Standing Rock, what was that about? I mean, the tribes had the treaties, they had the supposed legal right, which was completely ignored. I mean, you can't talk about these issues without talking about the politics. Mm-hmm. And you can't talk about the politics without talking about the driving force being our capitalist system, and how, well, the First Nations, they used a different economic system, and it was much more effective, it's much more sustainable. We don't have a sustainable economic system. And so, as we try to perpetuate growth that is unsustainable, we're destroying our environment and our ecology in the process. And we have all these little glib sound bites, natural gas. I mean, like, to me, the greatest weapon would be effective messaging against this, and finding ways of getting it into our media.
And I will say, just following up on what Mary Ann said is that one of the problems is that when tribes or First Nations do assert their rights in a legal challenge, it can be very tricky, because if they lose the legal challenge, that can actually narrow their rights and narrow their access, as has been historically understood. The court might find that they can no longer do things that they have been traditionally doing. And you know, the very like specter of all these projects being approved in and of itself narrows all of our access, because if you have these export terminals and you have 30 of them suddenly all along the coast with, you know, several tankers per day, numerous tankers per month, then that's interfering with tribal fishing. That's interfering with sports fishing. That's interfering with our ability to go out and enjoy coastal activities on the water. And so even though, you know, the proposal is saying it's not really necessarily going to interfere with those activities, when you look at you have to look at the cumulative effect. If, you know, multiple proposals are to go through in a region, of course that's going to interfere with the activities that are already going on. So definitely access is already a conversation that's built into, you know, fighting back these proposals themselves, because the permitting agencies don't look at it cumulatively. They don't say, well, there's already this much traffic in the water. If we add this project, then that's going to restrict people's access this much more. It looks at it just solely this project, as if only these 3 to 4 tankers are going to be on the water per week, and there's nothing else going on. And so one of the things that, you know, I would like to see more people bringing into the conversation is that, you know, like, for example, when people talk to their local government, well, we need to be looking at the cumulative impacts. Let's not look at this project as if it's the only thing that's going to exist out there on the water.
And we already have cumulative impacts to our water quality and accessibility. Often those are just a foregone conclusion that aren't accounted for, even when we do look at projects in a one-off basis.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that one of the fossil fuel industry's basic tactics, is avoiding any discussion of cumulative effects?
Yes.
I mean, that is the overarching strategy, and it's very, very effective. You just keep it local, and you ignore the bigger picture. The problem we have is seeing the big picture in the context of each situation.
Sarah, do you want
Yeah, I do. So as it was mentioned earlier, I'm a Hannes-Coos tribal member, and he brought up Jordan Cove is in Coos Bay. I'm also a 4th generation descendant of the Jordan family, so that area is where a number of Hannes-Coos villages have been for thousands of years. We think to the beginning of human existence in this region. So that means that all of our grandmothers are buried there all the way back. Because I'm not an elder for my tribe and our government is heavily involved in this, I'm also not at liberty to speak about it publicly. So that's an interesting moment in my career as an artist. But I'm really, really excited about your question about creative solutions and the conversation that we're having here, and this knowledge holder sitting here to my left. I had the best dinner I've had in a decade last night because of the jewels dropping out of her mouth. And what I think the underlying answer for anything on this landmass is money. If you want to save a tree, why don't you buy it? That's the way you'll save it. And she brought up some really exciting things about Jordan Cove that I hadn't heard, that I really hope that she'll talk about now.
I did try and bring it up.
You did.
You
You opened
did.
the door and here we go.
Well, I don't know if everybody here knows what that project is. So Jordan Cove is a liquefied natural gas proposal
On a sands bit.
in a earthquake liquefaction zone, in the right of way of a airport. All sorts of things about this project that could be catastrophically wrong, but basically liquefied natural gas is natural, well, I won't say natural because, like I said,
Fracked
most of it
gas.
is fracked now. It's fracked gas put in liquid form. So basically it's the exact same thing, but to make it liquid, you cool it to negative 260 degrees and it becomes a liquid. And so it also shrinks in volume. So if I'm trying to export gas to Japan or China, I can export much more at a time if I make it liquid than, if I'm trying to transport a gas. So it sounds fancy, but it's just basically a refinery for fracked gas that makes it liquid and then loads it onto super large tankers and exports it overseas. So one of the ones that has been proposed in this region is the Jordan Cove LNG terminal at Coos Bay. And, one of the things I've been trying to educate people about this project is that it's actually would be bigger than any liquefied natural gas terminal that currently exists in the U.S. and in the world, about 30% bigger. So when a company comes and talks about, this is much cleaner because it's natural gas instead of coal, but it's a terminal that's bigger than any terminal in the world. So we actually haven't seen what the impacts of that would look like. One of the things that fossil fuel companies rely on is knowing more about the issue than you do. And so that's one of the things that we try to correct through the work that we do at Sightline, is to take all this really complex information and put it kind of in bite-sized form where people can understand and to see what the issue really is. The question is not whether, fracked gas produces less carbon than coal when you burn it. It does. The question is, how much pollution is this terminal going to produce in this region? I'm not comparing this terminal to a super large coal terminal in Coos Bay, because there's no super large coal terminal in Coos Bay. It's not replacing anything where it would be cleaner. It's introducing a new pollutant into that region. And again, on a site that is very ill-advised. And so when you have a situation like Jordan Cove, what you're going up against is, again, this messaging of basically telling you to look at an issue that's not really the issue you should be looking at. You shouldn't be looking at whether this is cleaner than coal, because, again, it's not replacing anything. You should be looking at what is it going to be adding, so that even though it does burn cleaner than coal, you're creating a tremendous amount of pollution for the region just by building this massive, insanely large terminal. So it's a lot of sort of like tricky language and truthiness that I find myself fighting against, where I have to tell people, that is somewhere in the neighborhood of the truth, but it's actually not true. And so actually that winds up taking so many more words than the words that they use. I mean, it's almost like they can just show up and make some claim and people, that sounds really good. And then I have to say, yes, but but that's completely beside the point. And then explain what the actual point is, and hope they're still with me once I get to the end of explaining the thing. But yes, the Jordan Cove project is one that people in that area have been fighting against for 10 years, and they finally were successful when the federal government rejected the project because basically the impacts that it would have to the community were not outweighed by the benefits, because they didn't have any buyers for this gas. And so we thought the project was dead, but then the election happened, and the current administration has decided that they're going to get a liquefied natural gas terminal permitted in this region if it kills them, and specifically they said they're going to make sure Jordan Cove goes through. No clue why they have decided, just pick this one terminal out of all the proposals that have, tried and failed. I'm not sure why exactly they've picked Jordan Cove, but they have picked Jordan Cove. So it's alive again, and it's after 10 years of this victory that we had. After 10 years, we have to look at it again and try to fight off the terminal again. The good news is, the bad news is that it is back. The good news is that the market for gas is very depressed right now. The prices are very low. So what that means is that usually when you're building a big infrastructure project that costs millions or billions of dollars, you try to get buyers that are going to commit to a long-term commitment. So saying, I'm gonna buy like half of your product for 10 years. Well, then I know I'm gonna get my investment back. But when the prices are really low, people who buy gas can buy it on what we call the spot market. They don't have to tie themselves into a long-term contract with you. They can get someone to underbid you and buy it on the spot market. And so the problem right now a good problem for Jordan Cove is that the same reason that it was rejected in the first place is that it's probably not going to get any investors in the current market. And so it really comes out being a conversation that's really similar to what that administration, I find it hard to say these names. The current presidential administration, their promises around coal, that we're going to bring coal back and we're going to get these jobs going again. Well, no, you're not. I mean, it's dead. And people are moving away from coal. People don't want to use coal. And actually, the main reason that coal is dead is because natural gas is currently cheaper. And so you can't bring coal back without getting everybody to stop using natural gas, which you're not going to do. So part of my question is, I'm not sure if the terminal is what we typically call a zombie project. Like it's just moving forward, kind of shambling with no actual, it's dead, but it's still shambling around, is what I think is going on with this project. But the thing that you have to watch for is the market is not always your friend. Market conditions can change. There could be unrest somewhere that tightens up gas supplies and then prices go up again, and then we have to be concerned. But it is helpful to know what's going on in the market, because when you're local citizens going up against a big project, you're looking at companies like Shell, you're looking at companies that have a lot more money and resources than you do. So it really feels like a David and Goliath situation. So it's helpful to know what the market dynamics are, so you can actually know how desperate they are and how desperately they need to get this project through, because they will try to look very, very confident. And there's nothing these little activists can do to stop what we're doing. So it's helpful to know actually what's going on behind the scenes in terms of the market. Sometimes I find it can give me a little bit of confidence, but it's important to not get overly confident because things can change.
But also, because of the oversupply of natural gas, we are rapidly depleting our aquifers.
Yes.
And that's the downside.
Yes.
Like the upside, our greatest ally right now is China, because they're putting up, for every solar panel they put up, that's that much less liquid natural gas and coal that they want over there. They set up a grid over there in Southeast Asia. They will be an energy exporter to the rest of Southeast Asia. And that could end that fossil fuel. That's my dream. But you're right. It's market forces. Again, I go back to capitalism. And you can't have this conversation without looking at basically an economic system that is collapsing under its own weight.
And colonialism that insists on certain conditions, right?
Colonialism is
Because
bad.
capitalism by itself maybe isn't such a horrible thing, but when you overlay colonialism on top of that,
They're inseparable.
it gets, I don't know.
They're inseparable.
Are they?
Yes, they are.
I'd love to hear from Dan. I don't know.
Our thoughts on capitalism?
And colonialism.
That's huge.
Well,
I think it's separable.
Well, I wonder, actually, could I ask a question that maybe would allow us to hear from Sarah and Marianne a little bit? Marianne, you were talking a couple of days ago about basically indigenous worldviews and economic structures, and I think I made some Pollyanna-like comment about, well, maybe the silver lining of the administration of the president, who will not be named, is that we're all starting to see the holes in capitalism and looking for some different structure. So I wonder if you could talk about what capitalism squashed out. What?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was intrigued by was these older perspectives and you know, like, it was interesting to me when I was learning our language. And one of the things that I had trouble understanding was that there was this mapping that happens in Kwatwala, and the old people in the language would talk about the coast as upriver and downriver. And I couldn't understand that because we live on a river system, yes, and we speak of upriver as nal, and downriver as kwa, like that's a stem form for those meanings. But when they would talk about up the coast and down the coast, they would use the same terminologies for up the coast and down the coast. And it took me a long time. I really questioned it because I couldn't wrap my mind around it. And then it finally came to me that our conceptualization and the transfer of our relationships as based on a river system was being translated to the coast. And so when you think about the river systems, when you live by a river system, when the fish go up the river, the people who live near the mouth of the river have a responsibility to allow enough of the run to go upriver, and different peoples, communities live up the river. So there's a negotiation that takes place, an agreement that takes place in regards to communal property, and I actually don't even like using that word, but stewardship rights. So, and this was very different from kind of, I was thinking like about capitalism, because if you were a capitalist or in a capitalist framework, you would vie to be the first person at the mouth of the river so that you could basically garner as much of that fish run as you possibly could, and then basically like sell it off and become extraordinarily wealthy at the expense of the people who live kind of further up the river. But what was remarkable to me was that in Kwatwala, and it was interesting because I compared this with another language, Nuhulk, which are a different nation living further up the coast from us, and they have the same concept within their language, which is to say they conceive of the coast as a river system, and there's upriver and downriver, and therefore we must navigate our relationships with one another in that idea that there is a communal approach to our relationship to that which sustains us, which in English and under capitalism is referred to as resources. So this whole thing around individual property rights is extraordinarily problematic under an indigenous framework, because the whole idea of being able to own as much as possible goes against the idea that we have a responsibility to each other to have a community sense of well-being for and also even the idea that we don't own these things, that we actually engage with them in a reciprocal relationship, and that we respect what is being given to us, and we ensure that we give something back. And so that's when I was like kind of trying to sort through what I was learning in university and what I was seeing out in the general society, and what was being taught through the language and through our cultural forms at home in Kingham. The idea of community, responsibility and reciprocity was not what I was seeing reflected in kind of a modern capitalist condition. And so really what we've been trying to fight for all these years is not just the recognition of our jurisdiction over our territories, but to maintain also our way of being within those territories. So we don't see ourselves as owning those territories so much as that we have a sustained relationship, and that it's deeply embedded not just within our relationship to one another, but it's also deeply embedded within our relationship to our ancestors and to our descendants. And I don't see this reflected in the mainstream capitalist society.
I mean, the game that explains it all is monopoly. That's what it's about. It's about separation. It's about separating a very few of haves from all the others who don't have. And by exploiting all those who don't have, those people at the top become more and more powerful. That's capitalism, that's colonialism. They are inseparable.
Did you have, I don't know if you had your hand up?
A couple of questions I was thinking about. One is, how does your gender identity play a role in the work or the art that you do? And then also, just thinking about how the Dakota Access Pipeline, tribal-led movement became some national, almost even international. Do you see any potential, or are there already opportunities for similar movements along the West Coast between and amongst the tribes and the native nations?
Gender identity, sure. Well, can we get there in a minute? There were some other things I wanted to do there before. Property is theft. It's a pun, you guys. And kind of jumping off of what she's talking about and responding to the capitalist colonial conversation, and almost ignoring it for a minute to talk about our worldview. It seems very similar to yours, and I've noticed that indigenous groups around the world generally have kind of similar approach to land management or relationship, and it's about reciprocal and respect kind of conversation of equality as opposed to dominance. And so what I was taught, I study with Greg Archuleta of the Grand Ronde and Greg Robinson of Shugnook Nation, and they've enforced what I was taught growing up in my family, and so I think that, and those are Coos ideas, and so what I'm gathering is that the idea, when you're gathering or when you're in nature or when you're interacting with an animal or other people, that that you're equals. So this plant that I'm going to gather is a living thing, and it's my equal, and I'm not there to harvest it. I'm there to gather it, and before I can do that, I have to ask for permission, and I have to wait for an answer. And if the answer I get is no, then I have to. Consent is everything. I have to listen to the no, and I have to go on, even though I'm like really excited to have found the thing I'm looking for. No means no forever. I guess then we're getting into gender identity, aren't we? So that's the first step, is asking for consent. The next step is, and part of asking for consent is intention. What do you plan to do with this thing? Is it because you're greedy for it and you're going to get a bunch of money for it? Or is it because you have a wholesome intention and that's based in love and respect for, and so as far as weaving goes, I'm going to make something beautiful with it that I can use as a tool to teach people things. It's a political tool, it's an educational tool, it's got all of these other kinds of things, and so if the plant wants to be part of that, then it agrees. And then I also, after that, then I have to pay for it. Nobody likes to get ripped off, right? So then I'm going to repay this plant in a number of ways, through prayer and song and actual physical exchange. I'm going to leave something there, which is also a marker. So when I come back next year, I'm like, oh yeah, I already gathered here, I'm going to leave it alone. When the neighbor from down the road comes through, they're like, oh, somebody's already gathered here, so we leave it alone. It's a system, an honor system that everybody agrees on and is operating under the same relationship. You don't wipe it out. When you turn away and walk away and look back at where you've been, it should be invisible that you were there. It's like what you're talking about with the fish. So if you are, and then you have to follow through. This is something that art administration might consider. So on a promise that you said you're going to do the thing, then you have to do it. You can't just be like, yeah, I got my stuff, now I'm going to go watch some football or something. Then you have to do the things you said you were going to do with it. You have to, fulfill your promise. So it's just kind of basic manners too. It's not like we have some system that is alien to Western society. It's just not really good for greed-based. If you have what you need, then it doesn't. Anyway. I heard you're right, so you get it.
It's not in harmony with nature.
Right. So those kinds of approaches, I think, are I hear from indigenous groups around the world that sort of an approach, starting with equality between the different, rocks, water, plants, animals, humans, as opposed to a hierarchy where humans get to be at the top, an ego-based system. It seems like capitalism, racism is the long arm of the class system. The class system's invented to keep the money distributed in a certain way, and all of these things kind of work together. And I think that colonialism is sort of a science experiment based on those ideas. So I think that your question about it's kind of a chicken or an egg. They're all real involved with each other and the arms of each other, and they come after indigenous knowledge. They're just a new invention of humans, and it's they're greed-based and they're laziness-based, right? So it's a way to get more for your input, whereas a sustainable system has to do with this give and take. And cool. All right. So you wanted to talk about feminism and Standing Rock. Okay.
Can I just interject that a lot of the outcomes that come from the issues that we're talking about, access to clean water or pollution that comes from, fossil fuels, the people that are most susceptible to those harms are children and the elderly. And in terms of getting health impacts or neurological defects. And those burdens disproportionately fall on women in terms of the people who will have to take care of the people who are dealing with those impacts. And so that's something that's always sort of in the back of my mind when I'm looking at these issues and looking at health impacts to the community. I know that those burdens are going to disproportionately fall on women. And the second question was DAPL. Why do you think that DAPL became such a large issue nationally and internationally?
Well, I was just thinking because you all are spread across the West Coast. Do you see any opportunity if a major pipeline or natural gas project comes up again? That it could become a similar movement that's tribal led on West Coast based.
We already have one. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline in BC. It would be a transboundary issue because the pipeline's coming down into shared waters between Washington and BC. But you already have First Nations in BC who are setting up encampments in opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I don't know if Marianne or someone else who's in BC would want to talk a little bit more about that. But it's already being called the Standing Rock of the North or the Northwest. It's just that right now we're still in the permitting process of the pipeline, so we haven't gotten to that point where we were with Standing Rock, where they were directly standing in opposition to the people who were there with the bulldozers and trying to build the pipelines. But it's already building in terms of the encampments already being there and people being dedicated to having their encampment in the path of that pipeline and absolutely refusing to move. So,
Can I make one little plug on that? Because I'm one of the banking people who's been working for 3 years to keep that thing out of my town and this river and the Northwest. And the tribes have been very eloquently involved. They
say has the poetry that the science people that you represent, and I read your work. The Native people are bringing poetry more, and their hearts and their families and everybody, and they have been tremendously wonderful. But there's the last hearing is on Tuesday, 22nd, in Vancouver, to try to do the stormwater permit. We go through these hearings that take 8-10 hours. They give each person 2 minutes. The oil company brings all these experts who are very impressive and well-spoken, and all the people who want their jobs in construction. And then there's a bunch of little regular people. And a lot of them are people like me, because we're retired. We're the people who can go on a Tuesday when everybody else has to work. But it would be great to see more artists. It would be great to see more young people. The last one is Tuesday. Please, we need everybody. And I think artists have not been represented enough.
I don't want to talk for long, I just want to say one thing. My understanding is that the BC government has now come out in opposition to Trans Mountain, strong opposition, and the Trudeau government is saying we're going to push it through. What I wondered about was, is the new government, the Green government in BC, helping are they going to be an ally of yours on the fish farm issue?
It's really tricky, like the difficulty, when you were talking earlier about jurisdictions, and this is some of the difficulty that we have as Indigenous peoples, is because the federal and the provincial governments have separated jurisdictions to a certain extent, and so it gets really complicated under their systems to address issues. And so there's these complicated processes where the federal government has jurisdiction in certain permitting areas, and then the provincial does. And what's difficult for us is when they separate things like that. For us, say waters and lands are not separated, and we certainly have such a different perception of even the boundaries of our jurisdictions as nations, and how do we negotiate that. But what's being difficult is that the Canadian government, in both federal position and provincial, wants us to map to their understanding of these forms. So it's a assimilative. It asks us to agree to the conditions as they set them out. And I think part of the problems that we're facing provincially, I guess, is that the coalition between the NDP and the Green Party is so tenuous at this point in time. So you have these different bodies of authority kind of vying for their agenda to be pushed forward. And currently the federal agenda is that that this pipeline go through. But the agenda of many of the Indigenous nations is to push back against that and to say no. That being said, there's all kinds of things in the background going on where industry, and particularly the provincial government, attempt to, I would say, well, I can't say this current government, but basically the process with the prior Liberal government was that there was a extensive effort on their parts to basically infiltrate First Nations administrations to gain, help them gain the approvals that they needed. So that's created at times divisions amongst nations over what their positions were going to be. And it's a difficult, tenuous place for many Indigenous nations because so many First Nations are impoverished. So it's a similar situation when government and industry is stepping in, whether that's provincial or federal, and saying, you're going to get jobs out of this, you're going to have a better life because of this, and yet it goes against the principles and worldview. But there's so much, I guess, underlying issues in that regard. But it does seem to me, and this is one of the really positive things that I think has come out of things like the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, is that
when Indigenous peoples actually, get together and talk about these things, there is a mutual fundamental position that exists amongst us. Like, it's remarkable to have a conversation with Sarah, and basically the same teachings that have been passed down to her are very, very similar to the teachings that were passed down to me. And I think that comes from living very closely with the land in a very sustainable way. So there is a human way of being with the land that Indigenous people carry. And if we can somehow, like by working together with other nations, but if we could even help spread that position, that way of understanding relationships, with the broader society, then I think there's a chance there for us to push back against what's been happening. Because I know for myself, coming from a small community, that we do not have the capacity to fight the fish farms on our own. We have to form allied relationships with other nations who will support us, and even with non-Indigenous peoples who can come and support us. So that's part of the relationship building that we're trying to do here today, even.
Yeah, and I would dovetail on that a minute too, and to get into something exciting too, because we're talking about such hard things. And it comes out of Umatilla, Labrador's people. So, when Indigenous people are given back control, land management, all that stuff, they generally have really incredible results. Umatillas have been able to bring back a number of salmon species that had been all but extinct. It's a great example. Everybody, if you want to feel good, go research that. That's going to help you feel better all the way. So I think this group is all in cahoots on these ideas that there's something deeply wrong. There are some ideas from Indigenous cultures that look good. And we have examples in this state, of really incredible successes. So, I think it's in the room what we need, but.
This may seem overly obvious, but I think it's something we really need to stress. The disconnect between the First Nations view of the world and capitalism is really simple. It's that you view the world as an organism. You're connected to it. It's part of you. You are a part of an organism. Capitalism can see nothing but an artifact to use. The only thing that's connected to is a number on a line that says profit. That's the battle.
Well, and again, I think that's how the feminine comes in, because we're mistreating water, which is feminine, and mistreating women. So, it's not a valuing of the feminine. So there's an out of balance between the masculine and the feminine.
But I think, Sarah, the work that you do when you talk about being out in the bush and being on the river, I think so much of what a lot of us have lost is a relationship to our resources, to the things that give us life, right?
Yeah.
So that relationship to water and living on the water and being part of those systems and understanding them in a very physical way.
Right.
So could you maybe speak a bit to that process of what you do in your work?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. I'll try. So for us, because the continuum of knowledge was interrupted dramatically in the 1850s, then that knowledge began to hibernate in our passing it down person to person. But knowledge is cashed out in 3 places that I know of: in the baskets, so I go to find it in the museums, and I mean my actual ancestral knowledge. It's in my DNA, so if I can wake it up in there, and that's science. And it's in the plants where we got it in the first place. So, and I think this is an Indigenous thing, all of the technologies and science and spirituality, all of the different parts of our life ways, we gain through observation, being in nature and paying attention to it and listening to it and picking up what it's laying down, right? So if that's your starting place, then that's still there in the ferocious, beautiful thing that nature is, and still contains, against, you know, humanity's ugliness and attempts to kill it. So in my practice, I've been going to those resources and trying to awaken that within myself. And then my neighbors, the tribes all around me, help me by sharing with me how they do those things. So I'm trying to find a middle ground under it. And we really look to each other for that kind of exchange, which isn't about money. You know, it isn't about a financial, for us anyway, in our area, it's not money based, it's relationship based. So rich in culture, rich in relationships, you have plenty to eat, you have those things are what our wealth is based on. And so it's kind of everybody's putting in on it. Am I getting at what you're talking about or asking me to talk about?
That's great, yeah.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to get at too when we're talking about success against these forces of evil, there are some groups in Alaska who've succeeded against some of these ecological disasters, and their advice to me is vigilance, like the never-ending vigilance, and that you are to wrap everything in gossamer layers of protection. And like thinking of the zombie forces of evil, they're never really going to go away, so you also have to be somewhat in the same mind frame. And so, you know, and work with whatever your particular powers are, you know, thinking of your own privileges and the things where you have contact and you have like a way to push. If you've got money, that's awesome. But if you don't, what are the things you do? And so one of those gossamer layers that I can pull a string towards is getting into stuff you were talking about. So one of those little lines of land protection that's in there is that if one of these entities is going to destroy an area that that an indigenous group has a cultural or spiritual history of use for, they have to provide you with a similar situation somewhere else, or they have to move the thing. Now, you can't move an ancient garden that's been cultivated for thousands of years. It just won't work. You also can't regrow it somewhere else. You don't have the time, and it doesn't exist somewhere else. So one of the things that I can do is I can go to a site, and if I can see that there's 45 plants that are growing that are used for medicine and weaving and food, that to me indicates that this is a space that we've been doing this forever. I come and do it a couple times. I teach some students to do some things there, and it's alive again, right? So that's a precedence that we can use to, it's a gossamer layer. It's just one, you know, and everybody who's sitting in the room, you have cell phones, you have, which, you know, you can write stuff on them. There's all of these entities that are trying to do these things. They have to go through a process. The beautiful thing about our system is that it's a game. And if you can figure out what you want in the game, then you can try to work against it, right? So it's, you know, setting up a system in your life of like, on Tuesdays, I write a letter to a senator, or whatever it is that you've set up as your approach, you know, and inventorying your privileges and where you have access and figuring out how to push on that piece.
Well, and I was really appreciating what Sarah was saying about successes. Like, I think, you know, part of our resilience in working through all of this, and I think we can really look to our, you know, indigenous communities for that model, is just that amazing resilience to rise above the things that can just, I mean, they're exhausting. And so I think part of what we need to do in this work is really focus on our successes, give the energy to our successes, and not to the things, don't give airtime to the things that are dragging it down, So, I don't know, maybe for some final words, if any of the panelists or any of the audience members want to, maybe you can throw a few successes out there to end us on a high note.
That's a good idea.
I have something I wanted to ask the group about, and thinking about successes. And first of all, gratitude for all of your voices. Thank you very much. Some of the work that I do that really interests me is restoration of streams and rivers and wetlands and watersheds. And you had mentioned Grays Harbor earlier, and I do some work there. And I'm sure many of you know that it's a very economically depressed region. And there's a bit of hope that I see in the work that I'm involved in restoring even just an urban creek. It's been lost to daylight, lost to fish, lost to human connection for decades now. And in my work, when I go into these public meetings and I see the spark in these people's eyes when they think, oh my God, I could be like this again, it's so hopeful. And what I wonder is, I wonder about the opportunities for the intersection of science and art and community and creating that connection within communities and amongst communities. So I wonder what you all think about that.
Well, that's what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
Pulls 70 hours a week out of my life every time. And that's where it's all out for me. So you guys already heard all my steps.
Yeah, I think even that's what we're trying to do here, rather than just put up a single exhibition dealing with an issue that has a temporal frame around it and then it comes down. We've been working on this for a number of years now, and much of it has been dialogue, and now we're expanding our dialogue, and so we're looking at kind of rehabilitating and on a number of levels, and trying to think of things on a number of levels. And I do think at the end of the day, I'm always hopeful, and I know kind of, it's funny because the older I get, the more aware I am of the bad situation that we're in, but I'm still extraordinarily hopeful. And I think that talking is very important, and communicating with people is very important, and I use the artwork as a platform, and it's been really valuable for me to sit and hear what is being said and shared, because it helps me to kind of continue to move forward and know that we're not alone in what we're trying to do.
That's right. Exactly.
I think my thoughts on the community piece of it is that a thought that's sort of been in the back of my mind as we've been talking is that historically museums, and not all but many, their relationship with indigenous art and indigenous artists can be a very negative relationship in terms of the fact that a lot of the artifacts and pieces that are in museums were not given to them by anyone. They were not made to be displayed in the museum. They're taken from communities and put on display. And I think right now what you have in these conversations around water consumption and water usage and fossil fuel impacts is indigenous communities taking their art themselves of their own volition into the museum and using these things as a way to teach people and have conversations about those communities and about where art meets with resources. And I think that's a very interesting thing that's going on right now, and it's really interesting to me, I guess since this is the field I work in, that the conversations are happening around water and resources. And I just think that, maybe I hope I'm not deluding myself in thinking that that sort of like upends that that narrative or that historical relationship and changes it. And I like that.
Thank you. Blake or Michelle, do you have anything else?
Well, I just want to echo that I feel like this is one of those positive success stories, and I feel really grateful that you guys came and shared here, and
Yes.
I look forward to continued conversation and hearing more about the programming. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you.
Well, and
Yeah.
And
Thank
thanks to
you.
everybody for being
Yeah.
here. Great conversation.
yeah, this has been a great opportunity, and I feel like all these fortuitous things have fallen into place for us to come back here after visiting here 2 years ago and reconnecting. And this is really just a starting point. And as I said to everyone, that not everything has to happen today. That this is really just a way to start and to work out, and these things just take time. And I really appreciate everyone coming out and sharing their thoughts and being part of this process. And we'll be showing this in a exhibition research space in September in Victoria. So we're, as part of this project, we'll be opening the space called Waterworks Space. And so there'll be a lot of different ways for people to engage with these issues, and the documentation of this event will be shown in that space as well. So it's a great way to connect along the coast with what we're all thinking about and what we're all sharing across cultures, across disciplines and experiences. So that's really the goal of what we were trying to do. So
When is that?
it's opening on September 16th. Yeah, in Victoria. So come on up.
That's tempting.
Yeah.
I didn't ask for it.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Take
And,
pictures.
if anyone is too shy to speak up in front of the group, feel free to come up afterwards and ask questions. So thank you.